When young officers at Fort Mountainview spotted a woman in a faded military jacket, they couldn't resist mocking what they assumed was a stolen valor case, until a 4-star general walked through those same doors, took one look at her worn insignia, and snapped to attention with a salute that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks surrounding Fort Mountainview like a shroud, slowly lifting as the Colorado sun climbed higher into the crisp autumn sky. The bass stirred to life with its familiar rhythm, the distant sound of reveille echoing. Across the parade grounds, the steady beat of running feet as early morning PT formations moved through their routes, and the low rumble of military vehicles beginning their daily operations. Captain Stella Blackwood moved through this choreographed military ballet like a shadow, present but somehow separate from the world around her. At 52, she carried herself with the unconscious bearing that decades of military service had carved into her very bone, shoulders squared, spine straight, each step measured and purposeful, despite the slight favor she gave to her left leg. The injury wasn't visible to casual observers, but it served as a constant reminder of a night in Yemen when everything had gone wrong. Her silver-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, wisps escaping to frame a face that had seen more than its share of hard decisions and harder losses. The lines around her green eyes spoke of sleepless nights and burdens carried in silence, while the set of her jaw suggested a woman who had learned to endure whatever life threw at her. This morning, like every Tuesday for the past 18 months, Stella made her way toward the Fort Mountainview commissary. The building loomed ahead, its utilitarian architecture softened only by the American flag snapping proudly in the mountain breeze. She adjusted the collar of her military jacket, a faded olive drab field jacket that had seen better decades. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs, its original deep green color now closer to sage in most places. Most telling of all was the left breast area, where the ghost of removed patches created subtle variations in the fabric's fade pattern. The jacket wasn't hers originally. It had belonged to Major Derek Stone, her commanding officer and the closest thing to a father figure she'd ever known. Derek had died covering their extraction in a dusty valley outside Sana, and somehow his jacket had made it back when he couldn't. Stella had been wearing it for 8 years now, not out of any attempt to deceive, but because it was all she had left of the man who had taught her that leadership meant being the last one out. The commissary's automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Stella stepped into the familiar bustle of military family life. Young spouses navigated shopping carts loaded with groceries and children. Retirees congregated around the coffee station, sharing war stories and complaints about the VA, and active duty personnel grabbed quick meals between duties. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in the same harsh, institutional glow that characterized military installations worldwide. Stella retrieved a shopping cart, its wheels squeaking slightly as she maneuvered through the entrance area. From her jacket pocket, she pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper, her weekly shopping list, written in the precise handwriting that had once documented mission briefings and after-action reports. Every item was necessary, every dollar counted. The disability benefits she fought for monthly weren't enough to cover both her modest apartment rent and the physical therapy that kept her mobile, so she had become expert at stretching every penny. The produce section drew her first, where she examined apples with the same attention to detail she had once applied to intelligence reports. 3 for $1, she calculated, selecting the firmest ones despite their slightly bruised appearance. Vegetables followed: carrots, onions, potatoes, simple, filling foods that would stretch into multiple meals. It was a far cry from the MREs she had once subsisted on in desert outposts, but the military efficiency in her shopping approach remained unchanged. as she moved through the aisles. Stella's trained awareness picked up the subtle dynamics around her. A young corporal helped an elderly veteran reach something from a high shelf. Two seasoned NCOs debated the merits of different coffee brands, with the intensity usually reserved for tactical discussions. A military wife juggled twin toddlers while trying to compare cereal prices. It was a slice of military community life that Stella observed but rarely participated in anymore. Her isolation wasn't entirely by choice. The classified nature of her service with Wolfpack made casual conversation complicated. How do you explain gaps in your military record? How do you answer questions about deployments that officially never happened? How do you connect with people when the experiences that shaped you most can never be shared? Stella had learned that silence was often easier than half-dashed truths. In the canned goods aisle, she paused before the soup section, comparing prices with mathematical precision. Her fingers, bearing small scars from shrapnel that had found its way past her gloves during that final mission, traced over labels as she calculated cost per serving. The contrast between her current concern over 60-cent price differences and the millions of dollars in equipment she had once been responsible for wasn't lost on her. But she had long ago made peace with life's ironies. The jacket drew occasional glances from other shoppers. Some were curious, others dismissive. Stella had grown accustomed to both reactions. Military surplus stores sold similar jackets to civilians, and the distinction between authentic service and fashion statement wasn't always clear to casual observers. She had stopped caring about other people's assumptions years ago, or at least she told herself she had. What most people couldn't see were the subtle details that marked her jacket as authentic. The way certain areas had faded from specific types of wear, the tiny holes near the left shoulder where unit patches had been removed and reattached multiple times, the careful mending along one seam where it had been repaired in field conditions. Most significantly, they couldn't see the shadow on the left breast where Wolfpack's distinctive insignia had once been displayed, a wolf's head silhouette that had been removed so thoroughly that only someone who knew exactly what to look for might recognize its ghost. Stella moved methodically through her shopping, each item checked off her list with quiet satisfaction. Physical therapy had taught her to appreciate small accomplishments, and completing basic tasks without aggravating her old injuries counted as a victory. The ache in her left leg was manageable today, and her right shoulder only protested slightly. When she reached for items on higher shelves, as she approached the dairy section, Stella became aware of voices behind her, young, confident, carrying the easy authority of junior officers who had never learned that some assumptions could be dangerous. She didn't turn around, but her trained ears picked up fragments of their conversation about equipment shortages and training schedules. It was the mundane but vital communication that kept military operations functioning, the kind of professional dialogue she had once been part of, but now only overheard. The commissary represented one of her few regular connections to military life. Her apartment was off base, chosen for its affordability rather than convenience. She no longer attended unit functions or base social events. The commissary, with its familiar rhythms and military community, provided a tenuous link to the world she had once belonged to completely, but now existed on the periphery of loading her cart with milk, eggs, and a small block of cheese, protein sources that would stretch across multiple meals. Stella prepared to head toward the checkout lanes. Her weekly shopping expedition was nearly complete, and she could return to the solitude of her apartment, where the walls held her secrets safely and the silence couldn't judge her for the missions she couldn't discuss or the teammates she couldn't save. She had no way of knowing that in less than 20 minutes, her carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered forever. She couldn't anticipate that the young officers whose conversation she was overhearing would soon be focusing their attention directly on her, or that their assumptions about her appearance would trigger a confrontation that would change not just her life, but their understanding of service and sacrifice. Most importantly, she had no idea that fate was about to walk through the same automatic doors she had entered. Wearing 4 stars and carrying memories of a night in Yemen, when Wolfpack had saved his life and 37 others. For now, Stella Blackwood was just another shopper in a faded military jacket, invisible to most of the world, carrying the weight of classified service and unacknowledged sacrifice as she navigated the familiar aisles of the Fort Mountainview commissary. The voices that had been a distant murmur behind Stella suddenly grew clearer as their owners rounded the corner into the canned goods aisle. 2 young officers in crisp dress uniforms moved with the confident stride of those who had never questioned their place in the world. Lieutenant Tyler Nash, tall and lean with perfectly polished brass, carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. His companion, Lieutenant Megan Price, was equally immaculate, her blonde hair regulation perfect, and her uniform displaying the kind of attention to detail that spoke of ambition and pride. They were discussing training schedules when Lieutenant Nash's gaze fell upon Stella. His conversation died mid-sentence as he took in her appearance, the faded jacket, the careful way she compared prices, the slight stoop to her shoulders that suggested either age or injury. His eyes lingered on the worn fabric and frayed edges of her military jacket, and something shifted in his expression. "Well, well," Nash murmured to his companion, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by nearby shoppers. "Look what we have here." Lieutenant Price followed his gaze, her eyebrows rising as she assessed Stella's appearance. The 2 officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes, the kind of silent communication that passes between people who believe they understand exactly what they're seeing. Stella continued examining soup cans, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Years of operating in hostile environments had taught her to maintain situational awareness while appearing completely focused on mundane tasks. She could feel their attention like a weight on her shoulders, but she had learned long ago that the best response to unwanted scrutiny was often no response at all. "That jacket's seen better days," Lieutenant Price observed, her tone carefully neutral but loud enough to carry. "Probably picked it up at a thrift store." Nash stepped closer, ostensibly to examine pasta sauce, but actually to get a better look at Stella's jacket. His trained eye cataloged the details, the faded color, the worn elbows, the general air of authenticity that good military surplus often carried. What he couldn't see, or chose not to recognize, were the subtle signs that marked it as genuine. Field gear rather than a costume. "Amazing what you can find at surplus stores these days," Nash said, his voice growing bolder. "Some of it looks almost authentic." The word almost hung in the air with deliberate emphasis. Stella's fingers tightened slightly around a can of tomato soup, but her expression remained unchanged. She had faced down enemy combatants in desert compounds. She could certainly handle a couple of junior officers with more brass than wisdom. Other shoppers in the aisle began to take notice of the brewing confrontation. An elderly veteran in a Vietnam War cap glanced over with interest. A young military spouse with 2 children slowed her cart, sensing tension but not understanding its source. The ambient noise of the commissary seemed to dim as attention focused on the unfolding drama. Lieutenant Nash grew emboldened by Stella's silence, interpreting it as either guilt or weakness rather than the disciplined restraint it actually represented. He moved closer still, now directly in Stella's peripheral vision as she continued her shopping. "You know," Nash said, addressing Price but speaking loudly enough for half the aisle to hear, "there's been a real problem with stolen valor cases lately. People wearing uniforms and insignia they didn't earn." Price nodded sagely, playing her part in what was becoming a public performance. "It's disrespectful to real veterans," she agreed, "especially when they try to use it for discounts or sympathy." Stella placed the soup can in her cart with careful precision and moved toward the pasta section. The 2 officers followed, their conversation continuing like a shadow behind her. She could feel more eyes turning their way as other shoppers picked up on the dynamic. The really sad cases, Nash continued, warming to his theme, are the ones who probably never served at all. They put on old military gear and hope nobody asks too many questions. A small crowd was beginning to form, drawn by the unmistakable tension of a confrontation. Stella reached for a box of spaghetti on a high shelf, her movement causing her jacket to pull tight across her shoulders. The motion revealed more of the careful mending along one seam and caused her to wince slightly. As old injuries protested, the stretched out Lieutenant Price caught the wince and misinterpreted it entirely. "Probably overdoing the act," she murmured to Nash. "Trying to look like she's got war wounds or something." The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from the growing audience. Stella's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued her shopping with methodical calm. She had survived worse humiliations in her life, though few had been quite so public or deliberate. "Ma'am," Nash said suddenly, addressing Stella directly for the first time. His tone carried the artificial courtesy that often precedes an attack. "That's an interesting jacket you're wearing." Stella turned slowly to face him, her green eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that held depths he couldn't begin to fathom. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of breathing desert dust and yelling orders over helicopter rotors. "Where did you serve?" Nash asked, the question loaded with skepticism. It was a simple question with an impossibly complicated answer. How could she explain classified operations that officially never happened? How could she discuss deployments to countries the United States wasn't officially operating in? How could she describe a unit that had been erased from all but the most secure records? "Various places," Stella answered, her response deliberately vague. Nash and Price exchanged another look, this one triumphant. In their minds, her evasion confirmed everything they suspected. "Various places," Nash repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "That's pretty vague for someone wearing military gear." The crowd around them had grown larger, creating a semicircle of spectators to what was becoming an interrogation. Stella could see the mixture of expressions, some curious, some uncomfortable, others anticipating drama. She recognized the dynamics from countless situations where mob psychology could tip toward either justice or persecution, depending on who controlled the narrative. Sometimes service members prefer not to discuss their experiences, Stella said quietly, offering Nash and Price a graceful exit from the confrontation they had initiated. But grace required wisdom to accept, and wisdom was in short supply. "Oh, I'm sure they do," Price said with a knowing smile. "Especially when those experiences came from a costume shop." The comment drew more laughter from some in the crowd, though others shifted uncomfortably. The elderly Vietnam veteran frowned, his weathered face showing disapproval. Though whether for Stella or her accusers wasn't clear. Stella absorbed the insult with the same stoic calm she had maintained throughout the encounter. She had learned long ago that defending yourself against certain accusations often made you look more guilty, especially when the truth was too classified to share. Sometimes dignity lay in silence, even when that silence was misinterpreted as admission. As she turned back to her shopping, Nash stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper, but which carried clearly. "In the hushed aisle. This is exactly the kind of thing they warned us about in training," he said to Price. "Fake veterans trying to trade on real sacrifice." The words hit Stella like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they were so utterly, completely wrong. Every member of Wolf Pack had made the ultimate sacrifice except for her. She carried their memory, their unfinished business, their family's grief. To be accused of trading on sacrifice when she had given everything and lost everyone felt like salt in wounds that had never properly healed. For just a moment, her careful composure cracked. Her hand moved instinctively toward her jacket pocket, where a photograph had rested for 8 years. 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, faces partially obscured by tactical gear, standing beside a helicopter whose markings had been carefully blurred in post-processing. Only she knew it showed Wolfpack before their final mission, the last picture ever taken of them all together. The movement didn't go unnoticed by the lieutenants, who interpreted it as nervous fidgeting rather than the reflexive reach for proof she could never show. "Getting uncomfortable?" Nash asked, his confidence growing with what he saw as her weakness. Stella's hand fell back to her side, and she looked at Nash with an expression that would have warned wiser men to step carefully. But wisdom comes from experience, and experience was exactly what these young officers lacked. "Not at all," Stella said, her voice steady as bedrock. "Just remembering friends." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in months, but to Nash and Price, it sounded like another evasion. They had no way of knowing she was remembering Derek Stone's last radio transmission, or Sergeant Vanessa Cruz's laugh echoing across a fire base, or Corporal Benjamin Clark's terrible jokes that had kept morale up during the worst missions. They saw only what they expected to see: a middle-aged woman in a thrift store jacket, caught in a lie and trying to maintain her dignity. They had no idea they were staring at Captain Stella Blackwood, Wolfpack's executive officer, and the only survivor of Operation Steel Wind, a mission so classified that even its existence was need to know, and they definitely didn't need to know. But someone who did need to know was about to walk through the commissary's automatic doors, and when he did, everything would change forever. The confrontation in the canned goods aisle had drawn enough attention that other shoppers began to slow their carts and crane their necks to see what was happening. Word spread through the commissary with the efficiency that only military communities could achieve: whispered conversations and meaningful glances that communicated volumes without explicit details. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was restocking shelves in the next aisle when he heard the commotion. A career NCO with 15 years of service, he had seen enough real combat to recognize authenticity when he saw it, but he had also encountered enough stolen valor cases to be suspicious. Curiosity got the better of him, and he rounded the corner to assess the situation. What he saw was a woman in her 50s wearing a clearly military jacket that had seen better decades, surrounded by a growing crowd while two young lieutenants questioned her service. Rodriguez's initial instinct was to support the officers. He had been trained to respect the chain of command and assumed that commissioned officers knew what they were doing. "Everything okay here, sirs?" Rodriguez asked, approaching the group with the measured steps of someone accustomed to diffusing tensions. Lieutenant Nash turned toward the NCO with visible relief. Having enlisted support would legitimize what was becoming an uncomfortable public spectacle. "Just dealing with a potential stolen valor situation, Staff Sergeant," Nash explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone certain of his ground. Rodriguez nodded and studied Stella more carefully. He took in the faded jacket, the way she held herself, the careful precision of her movements. Something nagged at him, details that didn't quite fit the stolen valor narrative, but he couldn't put his finger on what exactly. "Ma'am," Rodriguez addressed Stella directly, his tone respectful but firm. "These officers have some concerns about your jacket. Would you mind clarifying your military background?" Stella met his gaze steadily. Rodriguez had kind eyes, she noticed, and the bearing of someone who had earned his rank through competence rather than politics. Under different circumstances, she might have liked him. "I served my country for 12 years, Stella said, choosing her words carefully. "This jacket belonged to my commanding officer." It was true, as far as it went. What she couldn't explain was that Derek Stone had been her CO in a unit that officially didn't exist, during operations that were still classified at levels these men would never be cleared for. "Which unit?" Rodriguez pressed gently. "When did you serve?" The questions were fair, even sympathetic, but they were also impossible to answer honestly. Stella felt the familiar frustration of being trapped between truth and classification, between loyalty to her fallen teammates and the need to protect information that could still compromise ongoing operations. "Various special operations," she said finally. "I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics." The evasion drew murmurs from the crowd. To most observers, it sounded like the kind of vague answer that people gave when they were making things up. Special operations was often the go-to claim for those trying to inflate their military credentials. Lieutenant Price stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to press their advantage. "Special operations," she repeated with barely concealed scorn. "How convenient, the kind that can't be verified." "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, trying to maintain a respectful tone while pursuing the truth, "I understand operational security, but surely you can provide some basic information. Unit designation, deployment dates, something we can verify." Stella looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. She saw suspicion, curiosity, judgment, and in a few cases, sympathy. What she didn't see was understanding, because none of these people had lived in the shadows where she had operated for so many years. "Wolf Pack," she said quietly, offering the only piece of information she could safely share. "Operation Steel Wind, Yemen 2016, Rodriguez frowned. He prided himself on knowing military units and operations, but Wolfpack didn't ring any bells. Steel Wind wasn't familiar either, though he was willing to admit that special operations often used code names that weren't widely known. Nash, however, seized on the unfamiliar designations as proof of deception. "Wolfpack?" he said with a laugh that drew chuckles from some in the crowd. "That sounds like something out of a video game." The laughter hit Stella like shrapnel. Wolfpack had been Derek's idea. He said wolves protected their own and never left pack members behind. The name had meant everything to 6 soldiers who had trusted each other with their lives. To hear it mocked by people who had never faced anything more dangerous than a training exercise felt like desecration. Corporal Jenny Walsh had been browsing the breakfast cereals when she heard the disturbance. As a military intelligence specialist, she was naturally curious about security issues, and the mention of stolen valor had drawn her attention. She approached the group with the confidence of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. "Excuse me," Walsh interjected, addressing Stella directly. "If you served in special operations, you should have documentation. Maybe a DD-214, or at least some form of military ID." Stella's jaw tightened. Documentation was exactly what she couldn't produce, not in any form that would satisfy civilian questioning. Her service records were sealed so deeply that even she sometimes wondered if the bureaucracy would ever acknowledge her existence. "My service records are classified," Stella said, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. "Of course they are," Nash said with theatrical resignation. "They always are, aren't they? Classified, need to know, special operations, all the greatest hits of stolen valor claims." The crowd was growing larger now, drawing people from throughout the commissary. Some came out of curiosity, others were attracted by the prospect of witnessing someone being exposed as a fraud. The dynamic was shifting from questioning to public trial, with Stella cast as the defendant in a case where the truth was literally classified. Master Sergeant Patricia Foster emerged from the customer service area, drawn by reports of a disturbance involving potential stolen valor. As the senior NCO on duty, it was her responsibility to investigate and, if necessary, involve base security. She approached the group with the no-nonsense bearing of someone accustomed to cutting through drama. "To find facts, what's the situation here?" Foster asked, her voice carrying the authority that came with 22 years of service. Lieutenant Nash quickly explained their suspicions, painting Stella as someone attempting to pass herself off as a veteran for unknown but presumably fraudulent purposes. Foster listened without comment, then turned her attention to Stella. "Ma'am, I'm Master Sergeant Foster. I understand there are questions about your military service. Would you be willing to accompany me to customer service where we can discuss this privately?" It was a reasonable offer, and under normal circumstances, Stella would have accepted gratefully. But she knew that privacy wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. She still couldn't provide documentation that would satisfy their questions. "Thank you, Master Sergeant, but I'd prefer to finish my shopping," Stella replied politely. Foster's expression hardened slightly. In her experience, innocent people were usually eager to clear up misunderstandings, while those with something to hide preferred to avoid scrutiny. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have to insist," Foster said firmly. "This is a matter of base security." The words "base security" rippled through the crowd like electricity. What had started as two lieutenants questioning a woman's jacket had escalated into an official investigation. Stella felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, all waiting to see how she would respond to this new level of authority. For a moment, she considered simply walking away. She could leave her cart, exit the commissary, and never return. But that would only confirm their suspicions and dishonor the memory of her teammates. Derek Stone hadn't raised her to run from confrontation, especially when the stakes involved military honor. "Very well, Master Sergeant," Stella said with quiet dignity. "But I want it noted that I'm cooperating voluntarily." As Foster led her toward the customer service area, the crowd parted to let them pass. Stella walked with her head high, maintaining the military bearing that no amount of humiliation could strip away. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations and speculative comments of the onlookers. What none of them knew was that in less than 10 minutes, General Christopher Wade would enter the commissary for a routine stop during his inspection tour of Fort Mountainview. The general was running slightly behind schedule due to an extended briefing about regional security threats, including a detailed discussion of historical special operations that had prevented larger conflicts. He was, in fact, thinking about Wolf Pack as he approached the commissary doors, remembering a night in Yemen when 6 American soldiers had saved his life and 37 others during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic mission. But that was still 10 minutes away, and for now, Stella Blackwood walked toward what appeared to be her complete humiliation, carrying the invisible weight of service that had shaped her life, but remained unrecognized by the world around her. The customer service area of the Fort Mountainview commissary occupied a corner space near the main entrance, separated from the shopping floor by a waist-high counter in the kind of institutional furniture that prioritized function over comfort. Master Sergeant Foster led Stella to this semi-private space while the crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, though their attention remained focused on the unfolding drama. Behind the customer service counter stood Specialist Amanda Chen, a young woman whose neat appearance and efficient manner reflected her determination to excel in what many considered a mundane assignment. Chen had been following the situation from afar, and her expression showed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the senior NCO approached with the woman at the center of the whale controversy. "Specialist Chen," Foster said briskly, "I need you to assist with a potential security matter. This woman claims military service, but there are questions about the authenticity of her claims." Chen nodded seriously, understanding the gravity of stolen valor accusations within the military community. She had attended briefings about such cases and knew they were taken seriously by base command. "Ma'am," Foster addressed Stella, "I'm going to need to see some form of military identification or documentation of your service. This is standard procedure for anyone claiming veteran status on base." Stella reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted several items: a current driver's license, a veteran's ID card that looked authentic enough, and a folded letter bearing official Department of Defense letterhead. She placed these on the counter with careful precision, Specialist. Chun examined the documents with the thoroughness her training demanded. The veteran's ID appeared genuine. It had the right weight, proper formatting, and security features that would be difficult to counterfeit. However, when she ran the ID number through the military database on her computer, her screen displayed an unusual message she had never encountered before. "Ma'am," Chun said, her voice uncertain, "your veteran's ID is showing up as valid, but your service records are marked as classification restricted. Contact DoD personnel. Security for access. I've never seen that designation before." Master Sergeant Foster frowned and leaned over to examine the screen. In 22 years of service, she had encountered various levels of classification, but this particular designation was unfamiliar. It suggested military service that was acknowledged but not accessible through normal channels. "What about your DD-2214? Foster asked. "Every veteran should have a copy of their discharge papers." Stella unfolded the official letter she had placed on the counter. "This is from the Department of Defense Personnel Security Office," she explained. "It states that my service records are classified and that this letter serves as verification of my military service for purposes of veteran benefits and identification." Chun read the letter carefully. It was printed on official letterhead, bore multiple official seals, and was signed by a director whose name she could verify through a quick internet search. However, the language was deliberately vague, acknowledging Stella's service without providing any specific details about units, locations, or time periods. "This is highly irregular," Foster said, studying the letter with growing skepticism. "I've never seen documentation like this. Specialist Chun, can you contact the number listed on this letter to verify its authenticity?" Chun picked up her phone and dialed the number listed on the letterhead. After several transfers and a long hold, she reached someone who confirmed that the letter was genuine but could provide no additional information about the service member in question. The conversation was frustratingly circular. Yes, the letter was real. No, they couldn't discuss the details. Yes, the service was legitimate. No, they couldn't provide specifics. Meanwhile, the crowd outside the customer service area had grown larger and more restless. Lieutenant Nash and Lieutenant Price maintained their positions near the front, their expressions showing satisfaction at what they interpreted as Stella being caught in an increasingly complex web of deception. Other shoppers whispered among themselves, speculating about the unusual documents and the strange responses from official channels. "This is exactly what I expected," Nash said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Fake documents, mysterious classifications, bureaucratic runarounds. It's all part of the stolen valor playbook." His words carried to Stella, who maintained her composure despite the growing weight of public scrutiny. She had faced hostile interrogations before, though never in a grocery store with an audience of fellow Americans questioning her patriotism and service. Master Sergeant Foster was becoming increasingly frustrated with the situation. Her experience told her that genuine military service should be verifiable through standard channels, but every attempt to confirm Stella's claims led to classification walls and bureaucratic dead ends. "Ma'am," Foster said, her tone growing more formal, "I'm going to need you to remain here while I contact base security. This level of classification irregularity requires investigation by personnel with appropriate clearances." The mention of base security sent a murmur through the watching crowd. What had begun as an informal confrontation over a military jacket was escalating into an official investigation. Stella felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between the need for secrecy and the desire for vindication. Corporal Walsh, who had been observing from the edges of the crowd, approached the customer service counter with a suggestion. "Master Sergeant, if I may, as an intelligence specialist, I have contacts who might be able to verify classified service records. With your permission, I could make some inquiries." Foster nodded gratefully. Any avenue that might resolve the situation quickly was welcome. especially with the growing audience making the commissary feel more like a courtroom than a grocery store. As Walsh made her phone calls, Stella stood quietly at the counter, her hands resting on the surface with the same stillness she had learned during sniper training. The conversation swirling around her felt distant and surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold rather than living her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years fighting bureaucracy to get her service recognized for medical benefits and veteran services, only to find herself in a situation where that same bureaucracy was being used to question her service entirely. The catch-22 was perfect in its cruelty. Her service was too classified to discuss, but its secrecy made it appear fabricated to those without proper clearances. Specialist Chun continued working at her computer, trying different database searches and contact numbers. Each inquiry led to the same result: acknowledgement that Stella's service was real, but refusal to provide any details that might satisfy the growing crowd of skeptics. "This is taking too long," Lieutenant Price said impatiently. If her service was legitimate, verification would be straightforward. "All this runaround is just confirming what we suspected from the beginning." Her words drew nods of agreement from some in the crowd. The delay was being interpreted as evidence of deception rather than the reality of bureaucratic complexity and security classifications. Stella watched the court of public opinion turning against her with each passing minute. Dr. Tara Coleman, a civilian contractor who worked in base mental health services, had been shopping for lunch when she noticed the commotion. As someone who regularly worked with veterans dealing with various service-related issues, she was intrigued by the unusual situation unfolding at customer service. "Excuse me," Dr. Coleman said, approaching Master Sergeant Foster. "I couldn't help but overhear. As someone who works with veterans regularly, I've encountered cases where legitimate service members have documentation issues due to classification levels. Perhaps I could offer some perspective." Foster welcomed any professional input that might help resolve the growing controversy. "Doctor, what's your assessment of this situation?" Dr. Coleman studied Stella carefully, noting the woman's posture, her calm demeanor under pressure, and the subtle indicators that spoke to genuine military experience. "In my professional opinion, this individual displays behavioral patterns consistent with actual military service, particularly at higher classification levels. The documentation issues, while unusual, aren't inconsistent with certain types of classified operations." Her assessment created a ripple of uncertainty through the crowd. Here was a professional with relevant expertise offering a different perspective than the prevailing assumption of fraud. Lieutenant Nash, however, wasn't swayed. "With respect, Doctor, professional opinion isn't the same as verification. Anyone can learn to act military." The standoff continued, with each side becoming more entrenched in their positions. Stella remained at the center of it all, a calm eye in a storm of accusation and speculation, waiting for a resolution that seemed increasingly unlikely. What none of them knew was that resolution was walking across the parking lot at that very moment, in the form of a 4-star general who carried memories of a night in Yemen when Wolf Pack had saved his life. General Christopher Wade stepped out of his staff car in the Fort Mountainview commissary parking lot, his mind still processing the morning's intelligence briefings. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His silver hair was regulation cut, his uniform immaculate, and the 4 stars on his shoulders caught the Colorado sunlight as he walked toward the building. His aide, Colonel Rachel Bennett, fell into step beside him, tablet in hand as she reviewed the day's remaining schedule. "Sir, after this stop, you have the 1400 briefing with the Joint Chiefs Liaison, followed by the budget review meeting at 1500. Wade nodded absently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The morning's discussion about regional security threats had included a classified briefing on historical special operations that had prevented larger conflicts in the Middle East. One operation in particular had been highlighted, a 2016 mission in Yemen that had saved a diplomatic team and prevented what intelligence analysts believed could have escalated into a regional war. The general had listened to the briefing with more than professional interest. He had been there that night, a one-star general then, leading a diplomatic security assessment team that had walked into what turned out to be a carefully orchestrated trap. If not for the intervention of a specialized unit that officially didn't exist, 38 Americans would have died in the Yemeni desert, and the geopolitical consequences would have been catastrophic. As Wade approached the commissary's automatic doors, he was thinking about Wolf-Pack 6 soldiers who had materialized out of the darkness like guardian angels, fought with precision that bordered on the supernatural, and disappeared back into classification levels so deep that their names were known only to a handful of people in Washington. The doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Wade stepped into what should have been a routine visit to a military commissary. Instead, he found himself walking into a tense crowd gathered around the customer service area. His security detail, led by Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, not to be confused with the Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, already involved in the situation, immediately began assessing potential threats. "What's the situation here?" Colonel Bennett asked one of the bystanders, a young specialist who snapped to attention upon recognizing the stars on the general's uniform. "Ma'am, there's been a stolen valor investigation," the specialist reported. Quickly, "A woman claiming military service, but her documentation is questionable." Wade's attention sharpened. Stolen valor cases were serious matters that undermined the credibility of genuine veterans. He began moving toward the customer service area, his presence causing the crowd to part respectfully. As he approached, Wade caught sight of the woman at the center of the controversy. She stood with perfect military posture beside the customer service counter, her bearing unmistakably that of someone who had served. What caught his attention first was her calm demeanor under pressure, the kind of composure that came from facing real danger, not manufactured drama. Then he saw the jacket. Wade's steps slowed as his eyes focused on the faded olive-drab field jacket the woman wore. At first glance, it appeared to be standard military surplus, the kind available at any Army-Navy store. But Wade's trained eye caught details that made his breath catch in his throat. The fade pattern around the left breast area wasn't random. It was precisely where unit patches had been repeatedly attached and removed. More specifically, it was exactly where a Wolf's head insignia would have been positioned. Wade had seen that insignia exactly once, in a classified briefing 8 years ago when he had been shown photographs of the unit that had saved his life. His gaze moved to the woman's face, studying features that he had only glimpsed in tactical lighting and under extreme stress. The woman standing before him was older now, her hair silvered and her face lined with years of carrying burdens that couldn't be shared. But those green eyes were unmistakable. He had seen them through night vision goggles as she coordinated radio traffic that had saved his life. "Captain Blackwood," Wade said quietly, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Stella's head snapped toward the general's voice, her eyes widening in recognition. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Master Sergeant Foster stepped forward, confused by this unexpected development. "Sir, this woman has been unable to provide adequate verification of her claimed military service. We were just—" Wade raised his hand, silencing Foster without taking his eyes off Stella. "Wolfpack," he said simply. "Operation Steel Wind. Yemen, 2016. The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Stella's careful composure cracked for just a moment, emotion flickering across her features as she processed the impossible. Someone with the authority to know was finally acknowledging her service. "Yes, sir," Stella replied, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "General, Wade's expression shifted as memories flooded back, the chaos of that night, the impossible odds, the precision with which Wolfpack had executed a rescue that should have been impossible. He remembered radio chatter in a voice he now recognized as belonging to the woman standing before him, coordinating movements that had meant the difference between life and death for 38 Americans. Without hesitation, Wade came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Lieutenants Nash and Price stood frozen, their faces draining of color as they began to comprehend the magnitude of their error. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized he had been questioning someone whose service was being acknowledged by a 4-star general. Master Sergeant Foster's mouth fell open in stunned silence. Stella's response was automatic, ingrained by years of military discipline. She straightened to full attention and returned the salute with crisp precision, her movements transforming from those of a questioned civilian to those of a recognized soldier. "At ease, Captain," Wade said, lowering his salute. The use of her rank she no longer officially held but had earned through blood and sacrifice, sent another ripple through the crowd. Colonel Bennett stepped forward, her face pale with the realization that she had been witnessing the public humiliation of someone whose service was clearly known to her commanding general. "Sir, should I clear this area?" Wade ordered quietly. "This conversation requires privacy." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, most people moving away but maintaining visual contact with the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Lieutenants Nash and Price retreated to a safe distance, their earlier confidence replaced by mortified horror as they began to understand what they had done. Wade turned his attention back to Stella, his expression softening slightly as he took in the details of her appearance, the careful way she favored her left leg, the slight stiffness in her right shoulder, the invisible weight of years spent carrying classified burdens alone. "Captain," he said formally, "your unit's actions during Operation Steel Wind saved 38 American lives, including mine. The diplomatic mission your team extracted carried intelligence that prevented a regional conflict and saved thousands of lives on all sides." Stella's composure finally broke completely. For 8 years, she had carried the memory of her fallen teammates with no acknowledgement, no recognition, no validation that their sacrifice had meant anything to anyone. To hear a 4-star general publicly acknowledge their mission felt like a dam bursting inside her chest. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Wade gestured toward the small cafe area attached to the commissary. "Would you join me for coffee, Captain? We have much to discuss." As they walked toward the cafe, the whispers began immediately. The crowd that had been so certain of Stella's deception just minutes earlier now watched in stunned silence as she walked beside one of the Army's most senior generals. Her faded jacket suddenly transformed from a costume into a badge of honor. The transformation was complete and immediate. The woman they had dismissed as a fraud was revealed to be exactly what she had never claimed to be, a hero whose service had been so classified that even its acknowledgement required the intervention of a 4-star general. The moment would be remembered by everyone present for years to come, but for Stella Blackwood, it represented something even more profound: the end of 8 years of carrying her burden alone, and the beginning of a recognition that would honor not just her service, but the memory of the teammates who hadn't lived to see this day. The commissary cafe occupied a corner space with small tables and chairs that had seen better years, but it provided the privacy that General Wade required for what would be a conversation 8 years in the making. As they settled at a table away from curious eyes, Wade dismissed his security detail with a gesture. Though Colonel Bennett remained at a respectful distance, her expression still showing the shock of the morning's revelations. "Coffee?" Wade asked, and when Stella nodded, he gestured to a young airman behind the counter who hurried over to take their order. "2 coffees black," the general said, "and ensure we're not disturbed." As they waited for their drinks, Wade studied Stella's face, seeing past the years and stress to the young captain who had saved his life in the Yemeni desert. "I've thought about that night countless times over the years," he said quietly. "Your voice on the radio, coordinating our extraction while under fire. I never expected to see you again." Stella's hands rested on the table, steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Wolfpack was disbanded immediately after the mission. "Sir, we were all reassigned to different units, different classifications. I thought you might not even remember our faces." "I remember everything," Wade replied firmly. "The helicopter malfunction that stranded us 40 miles inside hostile territory. The intelligence we were carrying about weapon shipments that could have destabilized the entire region. The sound of mortar getting closer while we waited for extraction that might never come." The airmen returned with their coffee, setting the cups down carefully before retreating. Wade waited until they were alone again before continuing. "Your unit appeared out of nowhere," he said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone recounting. "A miracle. 6 soldiers moving through that terrain like ghosts, establishing a defensive perimeter that held off 3 times your number while coordinating our evacuation." Stella's eyes grew distant as the memories surfaced, memories she had kept buried for so long that recalling them felt like reopening old wounds. "Major Derek Stone was our commanding officer," she said softly. "He made the call to sacrifice our extraction window to ensure you succeeded. We had orders to withdraw, but Derek ordered us to hold position until every member of your team was safely aboard the backup helicopters." Wade nodded slowly. He had read the classified after-action reports, but hearing it from someone who had been there added weight to the clinical language of official documents. "Major Stone was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor," he said. "The ceremony was classified, attended by fewer than 20 people. His family was told he died in a training accident. His wife remarried 2 years later," Stella said, her voice barely audible. She had to move on without ever knowing how her husband really died, or why. The official death benefits were processed, but she never learned he was a hero. The pain in her voice was palpable. Wade understood the unique torture of classified service, the way heroism became invisible. Sacrifice went unacknowledged, and families grieved without ever understanding the true measure of their loss. "Tell me about the others," Wade said gently. Stella took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to compose herself. "Sergeant Vanessa Cruz was our communications specialist. She maintained contact with command even after shrapnel from a mortar round damaged her equipment. She died ensuring the intelligence you were carrying made it back to Washington." Wade remembered Sergeant Cruz, a young woman whose calm voice had guided them through the chaos, providing updated coordinates and tactical information that had been crucial to their survival. "Corporal Benjamin Clark was our medic," Stella continued. "He treated wounded members of your team under fire, refused evacuation when the first helicopter arrived because he wouldn't leave injured personnel behind. A sniper's bullet found him during the final extraction phase." Each name Wade heard carried weight. These weren't statistics from a classified report. They were real people who had made conscious choices to sacrifice themselves for strangers they had never met and would never know. "The operation's success prevented a regional war," Wade said. "The intelligence your team died protecting revealed a weapon smuggling network that would have armed 3 different terrorist organizations. When we interdicted those shipments, we prevented attacks that intelligence analysts estimated would have killed thousands of civilians." Stella absorbed this information with visible emotion. For 8 years, she had known their mission was important, but had never understood its full strategic significance. To learn that her teammates' deaths had prevented such massive loss of life provided a measure of meaning to sacrifices that had seemed senseless. "What about you, Captain?" Wade asked. "How did you survive?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an old battlefield. Stella's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup, and Wade noticed the network of scars across her knuckles from the debris that had rained down during the final moments of the extraction. I was coordinating radio traffic from the command post Derek had established, she said. When the position was overrun, I was knocked unconscious by the blast that killed Derek. Sergeant Cruz dragged me to the evacuation point, used her body to shield me from enemy fire during the final helicopter lift. I woke up in a field hospital in Germany 3 days later. Wade could see the survivor's guilt in her eyes, the terrible burden of being the one who lived while better. People died. It was a weight he had seen crush strong soldiers before. The medical records from that hospital stay, Wade said, understanding dawning. That's why your benefits have been tied up in bureaucracy. Stella nodded. The injuries were real left leg damaged by shrapnel, right shoulder dislocated and never properly healed, traumatic brain injury from the blast. But the medical records are classified at a level the VA can't access. I've been fighting for benefits for 8 years, caught between needing help and being unable to prove why I need it. That ends today, Wade said, with the finality of someone accustomed to making decisions that couldn't be appealed. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. This is General Wade. Authorization code Sierra Alpha 77 Delta. I need immediate declassification review for Operation Steel Wind personnel records. He paused, listening to the response, then continued. No, I don't want a timeline for review. I want it done today. Captain Stella Blackwood, Wolfpack Executive. Officer has been denied proper medical care for 8 years due to classification issues. That's 8 years too long. After ending the call, Wade turned back to Stella. Within 24 hours, enough of your medical records will be declassified to process your benefits. Within a week, Wolfpack service will receive the recognition it deserves. Stella stared at him, hardly daring to believe that the bureaucratic nightmare that had defined her post-military life could be resolved so quickly. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Wade replied firmly. Thank your teammates who didn't make it home. Their sacrifice saved my life and the lives of 37 other Americans. The least I can do is ensure the survivor receives the care she earned. As their conversation continued, word of what had transpired spread throughout the commissary and beyond. The 2 lieutenants who had initiated the confrontation sat in stunned silence at a table across the cafe, their faces pale as they contemplated the magnitude of their error. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself remembering every word he had said, every assumption he had made, feeling sick with the knowledge of how wrong he had been. But for Stella Blackwood, sitting across from a 4-star general who remembered her voice on the worst night of his life, the isolation that had defined 8 years of civilian life was finally beginning to lift. The woman who had entered the commissary as a forgotten veteran was leaving as a recognized hero, carrying not just her own vindication, but the promise that her fallen teammates would finally receive the honor they had died earning. As General Wade and Stella concluded their conversation, the atmosphere throughout the Fort Mountainview commissary had undergone a complete transformation. Word of the morning's events spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve, but this wasn't ordinary gossip. This was the kind of story that would be retold for decades, each telling adding weight to its moral significance. Colonel Bennett approached their table with careful steps, her expression showing both professional concern and personal mortification. As the general's aide, she felt partially responsible for not recognizing the situation earlier, though there was no way she could have known about Stella's classified background. Sir, Bennett said quietly, Base Command has requested an immediate briefing on this morning's events. Additionally, the 2 lieutenants involved have requested permission to make formal apologies. Wade glanced at Stella, reading the exhaustion in her posture, the emotional toll of finally having her service acknowledged after 8 years of bureaucratic battles was evident in the way her shoulders had relaxed, as if she had been carrying a physical weight that had suddenly been lifted. "Captain Blackwood," Wade said, using her former rank with deliberate intention, "would you be willing to accept their apologies? I understand if you'd prefer to simply leave." Stella considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted nothing more than to escape the scrutiny and process what had just happened in private. But another part, the part that had been forged by Derek Stone's leadership philosophy, recognized a teaching moment when she saw one. "I'll speak with them, sir," she said quietly. "But I'd like you to be present." Wade nodded approvingly. "Of course, Colonel Bennett. Please ask the lieutenants to join us." Across the commissary, Lieutenants Nash and Price had been sitting in horrified silence since witnessing the general's salute. Both were career-oriented officers who understood that what they had done could potentially end their military futures. More than their careers, however, both were grappling with the moral weight of having publicly humiliated a genuine war hero. When Colonel Bennett approached their table, both officers stood immediately, their faces pale but determined. "The General and Captain Blackwood have agreed to see you," Bennett informed them. "I strongly suggest you use this opportunity wisely." Nash and Price followed Bennett back to the cafe area, their steps measured and solemn. As they approached the table where Stella sat beside General Wade, both officers came to attention with military precision. "Sir, request permission to address Captain Blackwood," Nash said, his voice tight with control. "Granted," Wade replied, his tone neutral but watchful. Nash turned to face Stella directly, his earlier arrogance completely absent. "Captain Blackwood, I want to offer my most sincere and unreserved apology for my behavior this morning. I made assumptions based on incomplete information and treated you with disrespect that was completely inappropriate for any veteran, let alone someone who served with such distinction." Lieutenant Price stepped forward, her own composure barely maintained. "Ma'am, there is no excuse for how we spoke to you or about you. We failed to uphold the values of the officer corps and dishonored ourselves through our actions. I am deeply sorry." Stella studied both young officers, seeing past their current embarrassment to the potential they represented. They were young, inexperienced, and had made a terrible mistake, but their willingness to face consequences suggested character that could be developed. "Lieutenants," Stella said, her voice calm but carrying the authority of hard-earned experience, "you made assumptions based on appearances rather than taking time to understand what you were seeing. That's a dangerous habit in military service." Nash winced visibly. "Yes, ma'am, we understand that now. Do you?" Stella asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because this isn't just about me or my service. Every day, veterans struggle with invisible wounds, classified histories, and bureaucratic obstacles that make their sacrifices seem meaningless to those who don't understand. What you did to me this morning happens to other veterans regularly, and most of them don't have a 4-star general to validate their service." The words hit both lieutenants like physical blows. Price's eyes filled with tears as she realized the broader implications of their behavior. "Your apologies are accepted," Stella continued, "but I want you to learn from this. Real leadership means protecting those who can't protect themselves, not attacking those who appear vulnerable." General Wade observed the exchange with approval. "Lieutenants, you'll report to my office tomorrow at 0800. We're going to discuss how this incident can become part of Fort Mountainview's leadership training program." Both officers acknowledged the order with visible relief. Rather than ending their careers, their mistake would become a teaching tool, though Wade's tone made it clear that their immediate futures would involve significant remedial training. As the lieutenants departed, other personnel who had been involved in the morning's events began approaching the table. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first, his face showing the strain of someone grappling with his own misjudgment. "Captain Blackwood," Rodriguez said, coming to attention, "I owe you an apology as well. As a senior NCO, I should have recognized the signs of genuine service rather than joining in the questioning. Stella's expression softened as she looked at the career sergeant. Unlike the lieutenants, Rodriguez had years of experience and should have known better, but his approach had been more professional and less malicious. "Sergeant, your questions were reasonable given the circumstances," she said. "The problem wasn't your skepticism, it was the system that made verification impossible." Master Sergeant Foster approached next, her bearing showing both professional embarrassment and personal regret. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for the way this situation was handled. I should have recognized that someone with your bearing and documentation deserved the benefit of the doubt." "Master Sergeant," Wade interjected, "what happened this morning wasn't a failure of your procedures. It was a failure of a classification system that leaves genuine veterans unable to prove their service. That's going to change." Dr. Coleman, the mental health professional who had offered her assessment earlier, approached with a different purpose. "Captain Blackwood, if I may, as someone who works with veterans regularly, I'd like to discuss how we can use this incident to improve our support systems for veterans with classified service records." Stella nodded gratefully. "Doctor, I think that conversation is long overdue." As the various apologies and conversations continued, Stella found herself at the center of a different kind of attention than she had experienced that morning. Instead of suspicion and mockery, she was receiving the respect and recognition that had been denied to her for 8 years. General Wade's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly, then looked up with satisfaction. "Captain, I just received confirmation that your medical records have been forwarded to the VA with appropriate declassification. Your benefits should be processed within 48 hours. The speed of the resolution was breathtaking. After 8 years of bureaucratic warfare, a single phone call from a 4-star general had accomplished what decades of appeals had failed to achieve. "There's something else," Wade continued. "I'm recommending you for a position with our Military Advisory Board. Your experience with classified operations and their aftermath could be invaluable in developing better support systems for special operations personnel." Stella stared at him, hardly able to process how completely her life had changed in the span of 2 hours. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position." "Captain," Wade said with a slight smile, "you've been fighting the system for 8 years and never gave up. You maintained your dignity under attack and showed grace when accepting apologies. If that doesn't qualify you to help fix the system, I don't know what does." As they prepared to leave the commissary, Stella reflected on the morning's transformation. She had entered as a forgotten veteran in a faded jacket, endured public humiliation and bureaucratic obstacles, and emerged as a recognized hero with a new purpose. The faded jacket that had marked her as suspect now told a different story to those who understood its significance. It wasn't a costume or a prop, it was a memorial to fallen comrades, and a testament to service that had been invisible for too long. For the first time in 8 years, Captain Stella Blackwood walked out of the Fort Mountainview commissary with her head high, carrying not just the vindication of her own service, but the promise that other veterans would never have to endure what she had experienced. The shadows were finally giving way to light. 3 months after the commissary incident that changed her life, Captain Stella Blackwood stood before a classroom of 30 junior officers at the Fort Mountainview Leadership Development Center. The room was modern and well-equipped, with large windows overlooking the Colorado mountains that served as a constant reminder of the heights that leadership could achieve. But today's lesson wasn't about reaching peaks. It was about understanding the valleys where real character was tested. "Good morning," Stella began, her voice carrying the authority that came from hard-earned experience. "I'm Captain Blackwood, and I'm here to talk to you about a subject that isn't covered in most leadership manuals, how to recognize and respect service that can't be verified through normal channels." The officers before her represented the future of military leadership, bright, eager, and confident in their training. But Stella could see in their expressions the same certainty that had characterized Lieutenants Nash and Price before their world-changing encounter 3 months earlier. She knew that certainty, while necessary for leadership, could also be dangerous when it prevented deeper understanding. How many of you have heard about the incident in the commissary earlier this year? Stella asked. About half the hands in the room went up, though she suspected most of them had heard some version of the story. I want to tell you that story from my perspective, she continued, not to embarrass anyone or settle scores, but because it illustrates principles that could save your careers and, more importantly, could prevent you from causing real harm to people who deserve your respect. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. Ma'am, is it true that you served in special operations, but couldn't prove it because of classification issues? Stella nodded. That's correct, Lieutenant. For 8 years, I was caught in a bureaucratic catch-22. My service reel, my injuries, were documented, but the classification level of my unit's operations made normal verification impossible. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her displayed a map of Yemen with tactical symbols and movement patterns. This is Operation Steel Wind, declassified 3 months ago for educational purposes. Wolfpack was tasked with extracting a diplomatic team that had been stranded when their helicopters malfunctioned deep in hostile territory. The map showed the complexity of the operation, multiple enemy positions, difficult terrain, and the narrow window for successful extraction. The officers studied it with professional interest, beginning to understand the scale of what Stella and her team had accomplished. The mission succeeded, Stella continued, but at a cost. 4 of my 6-person team died, ensuring that 38 Americans made it home safely. The intelligence they died protecting prevented a regional war that could have killed thousands. Captain Marcus Torres, a veteran of 2 deployments himself, leaned forward with interest. Ma'am, how did the classification issues affect your transition to civilian life? It was exactly the question Stella had hoped someone would ask. Imagine trying to explain gaps in your employment history when you can't discuss where you were or what you did. Imagine applying for disability benefits for injuries sustained in combat when you can't reference the combat operations. Imagine carrying the memories of fallen friends whose sacrifice can't be acknowledged. The room fell silent as the officers began to grasp the isolation and frustration that classified service could create. These were practical concerns that went far beyond the abstract concepts of honor and sacrifice usually discussed in leadership courses. The morning I was confronted in the commissary, Stella said, I had been fighting for medical benefits for 8 years. I was shopping carefully because money was tight. I was wearing my former commanding officer's jacket because it was all I had left of him after he died saving American lives. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Wolfpack before their final mission. 6 soldiers in desert. Camouflage, faces partially obscured by tactical gear, standing beside a helicopter with deliberately obscured markings. This is the only photograph that exists of my complete team, Stella said, her voice thick with emotion that she no longer tried to hide. Major Derek Stone, Sergeant Vanessa Cruz, Corporal Benjamin Clark, Specialist Kevin Park, Specialist Thomas Green, and myself. I'm the only one still alive. The weight of that statement settled over the classroom like a shroud. These young officers, most of whom had never lost a teammate, began to understand the burden that Stella carried every day. Lieutenant Chun raised her hand again. Ma'am, what should we have done differently? How should we approach situations where someone's service seems questionable? Excellent question, Stella replied. First, understand that real veterans come in all shapes, ages, and conditions. Military service doesn't always produce people who look like recruiting posters. Second, if you have concerns about someone's claims, address them with respect and dignity. Ask questions, but don't make accusations. Third, Remember that the absence of easily verifiable documentation doesn't mean someone is lying. It might mean they served in ways that can't be easily documented. Captain Torres added his own insight. Ma'am, in my experience, the way someone carries themselves often tells you more about their service than any documentation. There's a bearing that comes from real military experience that's hard to fake. Stella nodded approvingly. That's exactly right, Captain. But it requires taking time to observe and assess rather than making immediate judgments based on superficial appearances. She advanced to the next slide, which showed statistics about veteran suicide rates, homelessness, and bureaucratic obstacles to care. Every veteran struggling with these issues is someone's son or daughter, someone who raised their hand and swore an oath to defend this country. When we dismiss or humiliate them based on assumptions, we're failing in our duty to take care of our own. The classroom discussion continued for another hour, with officers sharing their own experiences and asking thoughtful questions about leadership challenges they might face. Stella found herself energized by their engagement and their willingness to learn from her. Experienced. As the session concluded, Lieutenant Chun approached the podium. Ma'am, I want to thank you for sharing your story. I know it couldn't have been easy to relive that experience. Lieutenant, Stella replied, if my embarrassment prevents other veterans from experiencing similar humiliation, then it was worth it. Leadership isn't about avoiding difficult conversations. It's about having them when they matter. After the students departed, Stella remained in the classroom for a few minutes, looking out at the mountains and reflecting on how much her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been an isolated veteran fighting bureaucracy alone. Now she was part of a team working to prevent other veterans from facing similar struggles. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Coleman, who had become both a colleague and a friend in developing support programs for veterans with classified service records. How did today's session go? The message read. Stella typed back. They asked all the right questions. I think we're making progress. Later that afternoon, Stella attended a meeting with General Wade and other senior leaders to discuss expanding the support programs they had developed. The room included psychologists, veteran advocates, and policy experts, all working to address the systemic issues that had created her 8-year nightmare. Captain Blackwood, General Wade said as the meeting concluded, your work here is having real impact. We've already prevented 3 similar cases from escalating, and the training programs you've developed are being implemented at bases across the country. Stella felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced since her days with Wolf Pack. She was part of a team again, working toward objectives that mattered, making a difference in the lives of people who couldn't advocate for themselves. As she drove home that evening, Stella passed the commissary where her life had changed so dramatically. The building looked the same, but she knew that inside, the culture was different. Veterans were treated with more respect, assumptions were questioned before being voiced, and systems were in place to help rather than hinder those seeking recognition for their service. The faded jacket hanging in her closet had been joined by new uniforms and the decorations that had finally been awarded for her service. But more important than any ceremony or recognition was the simple fact that she was no longer alone in carrying the memory of Wolf Pack's sacrifice. The shadows that had defined 8 years of her life had given way to purpose, and through her work, she was ensuring that other veterans would never have to walk through those shadows alone. 6 months after her confrontation in the Fort Mountainview commissary, Stella found herself standing in Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp November morning, surrounded by the marble headstones of America's fallen heroes. The ceremony taking place was small by Arlington standards. Fewer than 100 people gathered around a new memorial that bore the inscription, "In honor of Wolf Pack, warriors who served in shadow so others could live in light." General Wade stood at the podium, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as he spoke about sacrifice, service, and the price of freedom. But for Stella, The words seemed distant, overshadowed by the presence of the families who had finally been told the truth about how their loved ones had died. Carmen Cruz, Vanessa's mother, stood beside Stella with tears streaming down her weathered face. At 72, she had spent 8 years believing her daughter died in a training accident, never understanding why Vanessa's personal effects had been returned with so many items missing, why the official reports had been so vague, why her daughter's friends from the military had seemed to know things they couldn't discuss. "She always said she was doing important work," Carmen whispered to Stella as the general continued his remarks. "But I never imagined, never knew she died saving so many people." Beside Carmen stood David Park, Kevin's younger brother, who had been 17 when his sibling died. Now 25 and serving as a Marine lieutenant himself, David struggled to process the revelation that his brother had been a decorated special operations soldier, rather than the supply clerk listed in official records. "All these years, I thought Kevin was just ordinary," David said quietly. "I joined the Marines to honor his memory, but I never knew I was following in the footsteps of someone who died a hero." The family members' pain was palpable, but so was their pride. Thomas Green's widow, Michelle, had brought their 2 children, now teenagers, who barely remembered their father, but were finally learning who he really was. The complexity of their emotions was written on their faces: grief for years of not knowing, anger at the deception that had been necessary, but overwhelming pride in the truth that had finally emerged. General Wade's speech concluded with the unveiling of the memorial itself, a black granite stone bearing the names of the 4 fallen Wolf Pack members, along with a bronze plaque describing Operation Steel Wind, in terms that honored their sacrifice without compromising ongoing security. The crowd fell silent as the covering was removed, revealing the permanent testament to their service. "Today," Wade said, his voice heavy with emotion, "we correct a historical injustice. These 4 soldiers died protecting classified operations. That saved 38 American lives and prevented a regional conflict that could have killed thousands. Their sacrifice was real, their heroism was extraordinary, and their memory will now be preserved for all time." As the formal ceremony concluded, Stella approached each family member individually, sharing memories that had been locked away for 8 years. She told Carmen about Vanessa's infectious laugh and her ability to maintain communications under impossible conditions. She described to David how Kevin had volunteered for the most dangerous reconnaissance missions and never complained about the hardships they faced. Michelle Green listened as Stella recounted Thomas's dry sense of humor and his dedication to his teammates, how he had carried photos of his children on every mission, and talked about teaching them to fish when he got home. The conversation was painful but necessary, filling in gaps that had existed for too long. "I want you to know," Stella told each family, "that your loved ones died as heroes. They made conscious choices to sacrifice themselves so that others could live. Their deaths weren't meaningless or accidental. They were the ultimate expression of military values and American ideals." Dr. Coleman, who had become instrumental in developing support systems for families of classified casualties, facilitated these conversations with professional skill and personal compassion. She understood that learning the truth about a loved one's death years after the fact created its own form of trauma, requiring careful attention and ongoing support. "It's natural to feel anger about the secrecy," Dr. Coleman explained to the gathered families. "You've grieved based on incomplete information, and now you're having to process not just the truth of their deaths, but the knowledge that their sacrifice went unrecognized for so long." The memorial service was followed by a reception at the Fort Myer Officers Club, where Stella found herself surrounded by people who wanted to hear more about Wolfpack's final mission. But the most meaningful conversation occurred when she was approached by a young soldier she didn't recognize. "Captain Blackwood," the soldier said, coming to attention. "I'm Sergeant First Class Maria Santos. I wanted to thank you for what you've done," Stella studied the young woman, noting the bearing that suggested recent combat experience. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" "Ma'am, I recently returned from a classified operation in Syria," Santos explained. "When I had trouble getting my medical claims processed due to classification issues, my unit commander told me about your case and connected me with the support systems you helped develop. Instead of fighting bureaucracy for years like you did, I had my benefits approved in 2 weeks." The impact of Stella's work was becoming clear in stories like Santos's veterans, who would never experience the isolation and frustration that had defined Stella's post-military life because systems were now in place to support them. "That's exactly what we hope to accomplish," Stella replied, "making sure no one else has to carry that burden alone." Later that afternoon, Stella visited the individual graves of her Wolf Pack teammates, now properly marked with their actual service records rather than the cover stories that had been maintained for security purposes. At Derek Stone's grave, she placed a small American flag and spoke quietly to the headstone. "We did it, Derek," she said. "Your sacrifice is finally recognized. The families know the truth. And we've built something that will help other veterans like us." As the sun set over Arlington, casting long shadows among the white marble headstones, Stella reflected on the journey that had brought her from a humiliating confrontation in a commissary to a place of honor and purpose. The memorial they had dedicated that day wasn't just about the past. It was about ensuring that future generations would understand the price of freedom and the value of service that often went unseen. "General," Wade approached as she stood quietly among the graves. "Captain, I wanted you to know that the Wolf Pack Support Program is being expanded nationwide. Your work here will help thousands of veterans who served in classified operations." Stella nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with that knowledge. "Sir, it's what Derek would have wanted. He always said that leaders take care of their people, even after the mission ends. The mission never really ends, does it?" Wade observed. "No, sir," Stella agreed. "It just changes form." As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Stella carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her teammates' sacrifice had finally been honored and that their legacy would live on in the systems designed to support future generations of warriors who served in shadow. The invisible service that had once isolated her had become the foundation for ensuring others would never walk that path alone. The memorial behind them stood as proof that heroism, even when classified, would eventually find its way into the light. 1 year after the commissary incident that changed her life, Stella returned to Fort Mountainview for what had become an annual tradition, the Veterans Recognition Day ceremony that now bore special significance for the entire base community. As she walked through the commissary where everything had begun, she marveled at the subtle but profound changes that had taken place in the military culture around her. The most obvious change was physical. A new display case near the commissary entrance contained information about supporting veterans with classified service records, contact numbers for assistance programs, and a brief declassified summary of Operation Steel Wind. The display served both as education and as a reminder that heroism came in many forms, not all of them immediately visible, but the deeper changes were cultural, woven into the daily interactions and assumptions that shaped how military personnel related to veterans and each other. Stella observed these changes as she moved through the commissary, noting conversations and behaviors that would have been different a year earlier. At the customer service counter, Specialist Chun, now Sergeant Chun after an accelerated promotion, was helping an elderly veteran whose documentation seemed incomplete. Instead of the skepticism and bureaucratic barriers that might have emerged before, Chun showed patience and respect, working through alternative verification methods and connecting the veteran with appropriate support services. "Sir, let me contact our Veteran Liaison Office," Chun said with genuine concern. "They have access to additional databases that might help verify your service records." We want to make sure you receive all the benefits you're entitled to. The contrast with the treatment Stella had received a year earlier was stark. The assumption now was that veterans deserved support rather than suspicion, that documentation problems were bureaucratic obstacles to overcome rather than evidence of fraud. In the grocery aisles, Stella encountered Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez, one of the officers who had completed the new leadership training program that incorporated lessons from the Wolf Pack incident. Martinez was shopping with her family when she noticed an older man in a Vietnam-era military jacket examining prices with the careful attention that suggested financial constraints. Instead of judgment or suspicion, Martinez approached with respect. "Excuse me, sir, I wanted to thank you for your service. Are you familiar with the base veteran support programs? They've helped a lot of people with everything from benefits assistance to community connections." The interaction was brief but meaningful, a young officer taking time to acknowledge and support a veteran rather than questioning his authenticity. It represented exactly the kind of cultural shift that Stella's experience had helped inspire. Changes extended beyond individual interactions to institutional policies. Master Sergeant Foster, who had been involved in Stella's original interrogation, now served as the base's Veteran Advocacy Coordinator, a position created specifically to prevent similar incidents and ensure proper support for all veterans accessing base services. "Captain Blackwood," Foster said, approaching Stella with a warmth that contrasted sharply with their first encounter. "I wanted to update you on our program statistics. This year, we've assisted 127 veterans with documentation issues, connected 89 with mental health services, and prevented at least a dozen potential stolen valor accusations through proper verification procedures." The numbers represented real people whose lives had been improved by the systems put in place after Stella's experience. Each successful intervention was a veteran who didn't have to endure public humiliation, a family that received proper support, a community that functioned with greater understanding and compassion. Lieutenants Nash and Price, the officers whose assumptions had triggered the original confrontation, had completed extensive remedial training and were now among the base's most effective advocates for veteran support. Their transformation from antagonists to allies represented the kind of personal growth that could emerge from confronting one's mistakes honestly. "Ma'am," Nash said, approaching Stella with the respect that had been absent a year earlier, "I wanted you to know that your story has become central to our ethics training program. We share it with every new group of officers, not to embarrass anyone, but to illustrate how easily good people can make bad assumptions." Price added, "The program you helped develop has been implemented at 17 bases now. We estimate it's already prevented hundreds of similar incidents and helped thousands of veterans access proper support." Their sincerity was evident, and Stella appreciated their willingness to use their own mistakes as teaching tools. It took courage to repeatedly acknowledge poor judgment in service of helping others avoid similar errors. The cultural changes extended to the broader Fort Mountainview community. Local businesses had implemented training programs for employees about veteran issues, particularly the challenges faced by those with classified service records. The base library had created a special collection about military service and sacrifice, including materials about operations that had been declassified for educational purposes. Dr. Coleman, who continued her work developing support programs for veterans and their families, had documented the changes in a comprehensive study that was being reviewed by military leadership nationwide. Her research showed measurable improvements in veteran satisfaction, reduced incidents of discrimination, and increased utilization of support services. "The Fort Mountainview model," Dr. Coleman explained to Stella over coffee in the commissary, CAF, is becoming the standard for how military communities should approach veteran support. Your experience catalyzed changes that are now protecting veterans across the country. The ripple effects continued to expand. Other bases had invited Stella to share her story and help implement similar programs. Military academies had incorporated case studies based on Operation Steel Wind into their curriculum. Professional military education courses now included sections on recognizing and respecting classified service. Perhaps most importantly, a new generation of military leaders was being shaped by these lessons. Young officers were learning to approach veterans with respect rather than suspicion, to ask supportive questions rather than accusatory ones, to understand that service came in many forms, and not all of them could be easily verified. As Stella prepared to leave the commissary that day, she encountered a scene that perfectly illustrated the transformation that had taken place. A young soldier was helping an elderly woman in a faded military jacket reach items from high shelves, engaging her in respectful conversation about her service rather than questioning her authenticity. The woman, it turned out, was a Korean War veteran whose service records had been damaged in a fire decades earlier. Instead of skepticism, she received assistance, recognition, and connection to resources that could help verify her service and access appropriate benefits. Walking to her car, Stella reflected on how completely the environment had changed. The commissary that had once been a place of humiliation had become a symbol of transformation, demonstrating how institutions could learn, grow, and better serve those they were meant to protect. The faded jacket that had once marked her as suspect was now displayed in the base museum as part of an exhibit honoring classified service. Beside it was Derek Stone's Medal of Honor, finally presented to his family in a ceremony that acknowledged both his sacrifice and the years of secrecy that had surrounded it. But more meaningful than any display or ceremony was the knowledge that the culture itself had changed. Veterans were treated with dignity rather than suspicion. Assumptions were questioned before being voiced, and systems existed to support rather than hinder those seeking recognition for their service. The shadows that had once hidden wolf packs. Sacrifice had been replaced by light that illuminated the path for future generations of veterans. And in that light, the true measure of their legacy was not the operations they had completed or the enemies they had defeated, but the culture of respect and support that had grown from their story. The mission that had begun in the Yemeni desert continued in the commissary aisles of Fort Mountainview, carried forward by every officer who chose understanding over assumption, every soldier who offered help rather than suspicion, every veteran who found support instead of obstacles. Transformation was complete, but the mission would continue forever. 5 years after the morning that changed her life forever, Captain Stella Blackwood stood once again in the Fort Mountainview commissary, but this time as a guest of honor for the dedication of the newly renovated Veterans Support Center. The space that had once housed only basic customer service now included counseling offices, benefit assistance stations, and a resource library specifically designed to help veterans navigate the complex challenges of post-military life. The commissary itself buzzed with its familiar energy: military families shopping, retirees sharing stories over coffee, active duty personnel grabbing quick meals between duties. But the atmosphere was fundamentally different from that morning 5 years earlier. There was a warmth, a sense of community support, and an underlying respect for service that permeated every interaction. Stella wore her dress blue uniform, the ribbon rack on her chest telling a story that could finally be told. The Silver Star gleamed among her decorations, joined by other awards that had been declassified and presented in ceremonies attended by the families of her fallen teammates. But the decoration she treasured most was a simple ribbon, represented her work in veteran advocacy recognition for service that continued long after her military career had ended. General Wade, now nearing retirement himself, served as the keynote speaker for the dedication ceremony. His remarks focused on the transformative power of confronting uncomfortable truths and the institutional courage required to change systems that weren't working. 5 years ago, Wade told the assembled crowd, this commissary was the site of An incident that should never have happened. A genuine American hero was publicly humiliated because our systems failed to recognize and support her service. Today, we dedicate this center to ensure that such failures never happen again. In the audience, Stella spotted familiar faces that represented the full circle of her journey. Lieutenants Nash and Price, now Captains Nash and Price, sat in the front row, their expressions showing both the maturity that came from learning difficult lessons and the occult lessons, and the satisfaction of contributing to positive change. Both had become leaders in veteran advocacy, using their own mistakes as teaching tools for younger officers. Master Sergeant Foster, whose initial skepticism had contributed to Stella's humiliation, now served as the director of the Veterans Support Center. Her transformation from bureaucratic obstacle to passionate advocate demonstrated the kind of personal growth that institutional change could inspire. Dr. Coleman, whose professional assessment had provided crucial support during that difficult morning, had become a national expert on supporting veterans with classified service records. Her research and advocacy had influenced policy at the highest levels of government, helping thousands of veterans access the care and recognition they deserved. Perhaps most meaningful to Stella was the presence of Maria Santos, the young sergeant, who had benefited from the support systems developed after Stella's experience. Santos was now a captain herself, leading a new generation of veterans who would never face the isolation and bureaucratic obstacles that had defined Stella's post-military life. As the ceremony concluded, Stella was approached by a young lieutenant she didn't recognize. The officer's bearing suggested recent combat experience, and her expression showed the kind of uncertainty that Stella remembered from her own transition period. "Captain Blackwood," the lieutenant said, coming to attention. "I'm Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh. I recently returned from a classified deployment, and I'm having some challenges with documentation issues. My commander suggested I speak with you." It was a conversation Stella had dozens of times over the past 5 years, and one she never tired of having. "Lieutenant, you've come to the right place. Let's sit down and talk about what kind of support you need." They found a quiet corner of the new Veteran Support Center, where comfortable chairs and soft lighting created an environment conducive to difficult conversations. Stella listened as Walsh described challenges that were hauntingly familiar: medical claims, delayed due to classification issues, family members who couldn't understand gaps in her service record, and the isolation that came from carrying experiences that couldn't be shared. "The most important thing to understand," Stella told Walsh, "is that you're not alone. The system that failed me has been changed specifically to support veterans like you. We have resources, advocates, and procedures designed to help you navigate these challenges." As they talked, Stella reflected on how many similar conversations she had facilitated over the years. Each veteran she helped represented not just an individual success, but validation that her teammates' sacrifice had continued to protect and serve others long after their deaths. The Veterans Support Center was just one manifestation of the changes that had spread throughout the military community. The Fort Mountainview model had been implemented at bases worldwide, creating a network of support that ensured no veteran with classified service would face the obstacles Stella had endured. Military academies now included courses on veteran support and the complexities of classified service. Professional military education programs required training on recognizing and respecting diverse forms of military experience. The culture itself had shifted from suspicion to support, from judgment to understanding. Later that afternoon, Stella visited the base museum, where the Wolfpack exhibit had become one of the most popular displays. School groups regularly toured the exhibit, learning about service and sacrifice through the story of 6 soldiers who had served in shadow, so others could live in light. The centerpiece of the exhibit was Derek Stone's Medal of Honor, displayed alongside photographs and personal items that told the story of Operation Steel Wind. But Stella was most proud of the interactive display that allowed visitors to understand the challenges faced by veterans with classified service, and the importance of supporting them with dignity and respect. A group of middle school students was touring the exhibit as Stella arrived, their teacher explaining the significance of the display. One young boy raised his hand with a question that cut to the heart of everything Stella had worked to achieve. If their service was so important, the boy asked, why did it take so long for people to know about it? The teacher looked to Stella, recognizing her from the photographs in the display. "This is Captain Blackwood," she said. "She can answer that question better than anyone." Stella knelt down to the boy's level, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the most important work happens in secret to protect people and prevent wars. The soldiers who do that work have to wait for the right time to tell their stories. But when that time comes, it's important that we listen and learn from what they've been through. The boy nodded solemnly, processing the concept that heroism could be invisible and that recognition might come years after sacrifice. It was a lesson that would stay with him, shaping how he viewed service and the importance of supporting those who served. As the sun set over Fort Mountainview, Stella walked once more through the commissary where her journey had begun. The automatic doors slid open with the same mechanical whisper, but everything else had changed. Where there had once been suspicion, there was now support. Where there had been isolation, there was now community. Where there had been bureaucratic obstacles, there were now systems designed to help rather than hinder. The woman who had entered this building 5 years earlier in a faded jacket, carrying invisible wounds and unacknowledged service, had become a catalyst for transformation that would protect and support veterans for generations to come. The shadows that had once hidden wolf pack sacrifice had been replaced by light that illuminated the path forward. Derek Stone's final order to never leave a teammate behind had been fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined. Through Stella's advocacy and the systems she had helped create, Wolfpack continued to protect and serve, ensuring that no veteran would ever again have to carry their burdens alone. The mission that had begun in the Yemeni desert 29 years earlier was finally truly complete. But its legacy would continue forever in every veteran who found support instead of suspicion, dignity instead of humiliation, and community instead of isolation. Captain Stella Blackwood had carried her fallen teammates home at last, not to a physical place, but to a place of honor, recognition, and enduring service to those who followed in their footsteps. The light that emerged from their sacrifice would guide future generations of warriors, ensuring that their story of service in shadow would inspire others to serve with courage, dignity, and unwavering commitment to leaving no one behind. In the end, that was the truest measure of their victory, not the missions they completed or the enemies they defeated, but the culture of support and understanding that grew from their sacrifice, ensuring that all who served would be honored, respected, and cared for as they deserved. The circle was complete, but the story would continue forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.